next speaker, finally, here, Victoria Harrison on A Better Chance.
Murray Bowen considered therapy for the therapist and the other person as a research project. This presentation will describe one example of systems therapy and the difference it makes for one participant in the Observations of Change research project that I've been conducting since 2013. I want to use the example to discuss with you what Bowen theory can add for understanding reactions that contribute towards symptoms and for understanding changes that occur when someone is working on differentiation of self, this basis for systems therapy. That learning how the organism operates and understanding the reactivity we experience, controlling anxiety, and learning to better adapt to the fortunes and misfortunes of life can give nature a better chance, not perfect it into some sort of ideal state. The Observations of Change research project addresses these questions. Can people modify anxiety reactions associated with symptoms that are also associated with adverse early life experiences and a multi-generational history of reactivity, as well as contemporary nodal life events? This is an effort to connect some of the dots between the literature in other fields that look at the impact of stress or stress reactions on symptom development, but also on resilience. This research project addresses the question, do these changes that can be observed and accomplished in anxiety reactions, physiological reactions, and behaviors, are those changes associated with improvement in symptoms or functioning for the person, but also for their family? And last, how does one account for variation in the changes that occur through participation in therapy based on differentiation of self? Any of you in clinical practice and who have observed people know that everyone does not respond in the same way to the process of working on differentiation of self. For some, it is a slower go, and for others, the changes are more immediate and somewhat dramatic. I want to know what makes the difference and how people progress. The design of the research project includes gathering as much factual information as possible about a multi-generational family diagram beginning with 3 generations, where people research facts of functioning for all members of each generation. People who are participating in that process are also meeting quarterly to obtain measures of physiological reactivity and cortisol and alpha amylase salivary samples. People are also recording on a daily basis nodal events in the family, the number of family members with whom they have contact in a month, not how many times I talk to mother, but how many family members do I email, talk to, tweet, or see in person in a month. People document and describe the steps they take toward differentiation of self, and document and describe changes in symptoms and functioning that occur for the person and the family. Some people use the diary format, my family, myself, as part of the research project, other people just keep track on a factual basis in a notebook in their pocket. For those who are newer to Bowen theory and to the work on differentiation of self, this is a quick review of what those steps involve. And they include increasing contact with more members of the family and developing a more person-to-person open relationship with every living member of the family. If ever one wants a project that exceeds one's capability, this is one to tackle. To become a more accurate observer of self and others, to increase the ability to recognize and control one's own anxious reactions, to learn more factual history, to define principles, life goals, and beliefs and live by them, and to be more of a separate, well-defined self in all of these relationships. Needless to say, no one does this in one day, 1 week, or even a year. Hence, this project is one that has now extended 4 years and is ongoing. The person that I will present today is an illustration of someone who has been in the project since the beginning when she started the postgraduate program in 2013. Ms. B, I'll call her, does not experience physical or mental health symptoms herself, but there are symptoms in her relationships, in marriage, in her children, and in relationship to her children. This is her family diagram, which I will return to. This is Ms. B. This is her first marriage, her second marriage, and her 2 first children, a third stillborn, and then her husband's stepsons. The contemporary expressions of anxious patterns when Ms. B began the postgraduate program and the research project are these. Ms. B was intensely involved with her mother, protecting, defending, and managing her mother's conflictual relationship with her brother. Ms. B would take her side, her mother's side, and represent her interests rather than her own, and had a distant and somewhat strained relationship with her uncle, especially after their mother, the grandmother, had died. In a second triangle, Ms. B is anxiously focused on her son and her relationship with her son, and more distant from her former husband, as is often the case after a divorce. She is anxious and pursuing anxiously her son and critical of her ex for maintaining that distance. The son began to live with his father in 2012 when one of her stepsons moved into the house and tensions rose. So all 3 agreed for the move, and that move really was followed by an increase in anxiety and anxious focus. During this time, her son begins to flounder at school, his grades drop, and in 2 months after Ms. B started the postgraduate program and the research project, her son was caught with pot and alcohol in a car with friends. And that initiated a number of opportunities that Ms. B did not miss to begin to observe herself and the reactivity in this family triangle and manage herself differently. But before I go to that, I want to return to the multi-generational history of the family, partly because developing a factual history of every family we are related to and developing a personal relationship with as many people as possible is a basic methodology in psychotherapy based in Bowen theory. And it is necessary for most people, myself included, to become a more aware and objective observer. So here are some of the facts of adversity and patterns of reaction that Ms. B discovered and described for her family of origin. Ms. Rossio, I'm going to need you to watch the clock because I can't make my phone work. My watch broke, my phone doesn't. Thank you. I just need you to tell me 5 minutes before, please. Ms. B was 9 months old when her parents conceived her sister, and her father resumed manic episodes that had begun when he was 18 and resulted in his early discharge from the military. Her father. He had been stable during college and when he married, but after he resumed manic episodes, he left his wife and daughter and was hospitalized from 1964 to 1971 when he was stabilized with lithium treatment. He returned to live with his parents after that, and his wife, Ms. B's mother, moved the 2 daughters in with her mother, who had been widowed for about a decade. As a young child, Ms. B protected and defended her mother in the conflictual relationship that developed between mother and grandmother. Grandmother both babied her daughter and also reacted with anxiety and criticism when her daughter showed inklings of independence. Ms. B grew up in this context, in this triangle, and when her mother moved out with the 2 daughters in I forget the date. When mother moved out, she began to work as a nurse, and Ms. B was often in charge at home. There was a series of men friends until mother marries again in 1981, which is the same year that Ms. B moves to study in London and meets the man that she will marry. Ms. B marries in 1982, and she and her husband live in the United States, where they begin their family. Now, I want to quickly review some of the adversity and reactivity back a generation that Ms. B discovered when she began to ask questions and study the history of her family. Ms. B's father is an only child with anxious parents. His father was the youngest of 8 children and described as the baby. One of the grandfather's older brothers drowned at age 8, and he remained close to home and close to several siblings. Mr. B's father describes his father as critical and that their meals were full of conflict and tension. His mother was a quiet woman who moved away from her family when she married, and they lived near her husband's family. Ms. B's mother's father died when she was 8. Ms. B's mother's father died when she was 8, and Ms. B's mother called upon the firstborn brother to be the man of the house and to be in charge. This uncle acts as if he knows what is best for everyone, even now. Ms. B's mother does not know much about her family history, and Ms. B faces some interesting and fun research projects genealogical research to know more about the history. Now, you have a copy of the physiological criteria for anxiety measured in fingertip temperature, which is traced here in red, EDR, electrodermal activity, skin sweat response, measured in green on this scale in microohms, skeletal muscle activity in blue here, and 14 hertz EMG measured in red at the bottom. Now this is the graph of the first baseline that Ms. B provided in the research project. People talk about their family history, their family work for the first 20 minutes, and then sit quietly for now 15 minutes. This started out as 10, while hooked up to the equipment that's measuring these indicators of reactivity. And you can see here that Ms. B's fingertip temperature reflects sympathetic nervous system activity, or the fight or flight response, from the beginning, and as she sits quietly, it continues to cool. You can see that her adrenaline rises and continues to rise, except for the very tail end there of sitting quietly. It's up at 30 microohms. You can read the criteria. Skeletal muscle activity does not reflect the anxiety to the degree that the skin temperature and adrenaline do. Now look at the changes in these measures that have happened for this person between September 13th and March and June 2016. You can see the drop, you can see the drop in skin sweat response happens within the first 6 months of the study. And the level of adrenaline decreases to active but at ease level and stays there, with some up and down, but in the range of active but at ease. Fingertip temperature is a little slower to begin to reflect the decrease in sympathetic nervous system activity, but by March 15, she has begun to increase in fingertip temperature and sustain warmer, less vasoconstriction, less sympathetic nervous system, innervated fingertip temperature. Her muscle activity varies in the active but at ease range. Cortisol is an interesting measure here, an interesting reflection of Ms. B's anxiety levels. I won't be able to go into great detail, but the research on salivary cortisol indicates that her initial levels would be at the low end of moderate, the low end of the range, indicating more exhaustion from sustained activity than relaxation. And by June, the end of the first year of the study, Ms. B is beginning to show an increase in cortisol into the active, energetic, less shut down range. Now, here we change labs and change criteria, so you'll just have to trust me. I'm not faking you on this, that these levels here, as measured by Doug Granger at Salametrics in California, indicate more active, energetic cortisol. I can talk about the protocol later. EEG, measured at 14 hertz, is a measure of what I think is the connection between intellect and emotional reactivity that John Allman describes in his research and Murray Bowen predicted as in his writing about the organization of the emotional system, the intellectual system, and the feeling system. And in this example, you can see Ms. B's level of 14 hertz rise while talking and while sitting quietly, and up and down, month to month or quarter to quarter. People count the number of people with whom they have contact. This puts me to shame. Look at the number of people with whom she has contact month to month and quarter to quarter. Each one of those measures has a literature and a relevance of its own that I cannot discuss today. What I want to do is rush along to show you a little bit of what she's doing between quarters that are bringing about and contributing toward the changes in these measures. So that while do you have the graph on the flip side of this? Good. You can track the dates yourself. You can look. Do you have this graph on the flip side of the physiology? Yeah, good. So during September 2013, she is increasing her one-to-one contact with Uncle and making personal visits, personal phone calls, increasing the contact with him. In 2013, she begins to take positions, including a letter written to each, that she will no longer deliver messages, negotiate the estate challenges that they face with each other. They are refusing to talk to each other at this point and only talking to Ms. B about how are you going to get me $100 more, or how are you going to straighten this out for me with your uncle. In 2013, she wrote a letter separating herself from that job, and they blew up at her, and she was able to sustain her stability during that blow-up time. In 11/2014, there is a powerful visit to her own father where she learns a great deal of family history. And over the holidays, she begins to invite her uncle to the family gatherings and describes during those efforts, before and during those efforts, a spike in anxiety, as she would recognize it, followed by an increased stability and a decline in the anxiety level present. Now, her work in all three of these triangles, in the triangle with her mother and uncle, in the triangle with her husband and son, ex-husband, first husband and son, and in the triangles with her husband and stepsons, she's working parallel at all times. There's just not time to tell you everything she is documenting or show you the whole timeline. But I think this is really significant in terms of the change in physiology. Noted. In 2013, December, her son is arrested. And that activates the involvement between mother and son. But Ms. B takes this as an opportunity to increase her involvement with her former husband, in which she begins to define what she will and will not do and what she will leave to the two of them to take care of. And she maintains that through the court and diversion program that the son is required by the courts. In 11/2014, she takes the position with her son and his dad that she will not meet with all three of them together and focus on him as a way of solving the problems and the dilemmas they face. So she begins to increase one-to-one contact with her ex-husband and one-to-one with her son as they talk about college and school. In December 2015, in August 2015, she visits London by herself and visits her former mother-in-law and her ex-husband's family, which brings alive a number of ways to understand and relate to her former husband without maintaining as much focus on her son and without activating a romance. During this time, in December 2015, her son makes the honor roll and begins to take charge of his own college applications and begins the process of making that decision himself, which then integrates back into activating an opportunity for her to define more of herself with her uncle about a situation that replicated her own youth. Her uncle paid for her college and in the process told her where to go to college and she conceded, although she wanted to go somewhere else. In this situation, she took the position with her uncle that the decision was up to her son and that she would support the decision that her son would make. Thank you for your generosity, however. And that is how that decision proceeded, and with an increase in stability for all involved. Now, what changes? Quick summary. Although I wasn't able to illustrate as much as I would like, the details of the steps that Ms. B took and Twin and how they correlate with the changes, these are a summary of the changes that she was able to accomplish. With the time remaining, I want to discuss some of the contributions Bowen theory and hopefully this project can make for understanding factors that impact health and functioning over the generations, not just within these circumstances. 2, I want to discuss contributions Bowen theory can make to understanding the variation in reversibility of the changes that are possible through systems therapy. I'm working at this point to relate the research project to the literature in other fields in an effort to demonstrate what Bowen theory can contribute to fields that for the most part focus on the individual. There is substantial, I breathe now, there's substantial research in the study of life events in health that began with the work of Thomas Holmes and Robert Ray in 1967. There are studies of adverse childhood experiences that began in 1998, and now there are a growing number of studies in the field of epigenetic influences over generations that document various ways that relationships between family members can impact health and symptoms of adults. Most of those fields focus on, define an event as stressful or traumatic, or focus on a relationship as traumatic or stressful. The literature documents the family or the social environment, poverty, abuse, the functioning of parents, as responsible for establishing a level of reactivity that they've documented in physiology or in bad habits, such as obesity or risk-taking, smoking, drug use, or promiscuity, that would mediate the impact of history into adult health and functioning. Ms. B is a particularly, now some of the people in the Observations of Change Research Project might fit the criteria better for adverse childhood experiences or epigenetic influences, but Ms. B does not. Ms. B has a very low, number 2, adverse childhood experience score as defined by the categories. One of the things that I think Bowen theory adds is that it expands the understanding of what is the nature of adversity or challenge for the human. That it is much more common, everyday, ever occurring, and ordinary than abuse, sexual abuse, incest, or trauma. Those happen, but they are not required for the development of symptoms, as I've observed in my clinical project and in this research. Bowen theory defines the nature of adversity and reactions to adversity and their impact in terms of the shifts, the disturbances that are produced in the relationship system that we depend upon. Michael Kerr described, I think, these qualities well in an article, 1992 article in Behavioral Medicine, where he wrote that an individual's adaptive capacity is strained by events that have the following types of impact. They disturb the emotional connections with others. They increase the anxious focus of others on self. They increase the dependence on others or by others on self. They threaten the functioning of others that we depend upon, or increase one's level of responsibility and the degree to which others depend upon self. These are characteristics I ask people to note, date, and describe alongside nodal life events and adverse childhood experiences, with the hope that one day it will be possible to demonstrate that those events and experiences that have the largest and the longest reaching impact are those that meet these qualifications and help discern the difference between those who have adverse life experiences and epigenetic factors, but may or may not develop the same degree of symptoms or reactivity. One of the other, I just couldn't leave this out. One of the other differences between Bowen theory as a multi-generational history of the family is that it permits a way to incorporate research in defining characteristics, experiences, factors, and facts that can be observed over many generations in the family that are studied in the epigenetic research and documented in terms of their impact. And that the impact, the epigenetic research would indicate the impact of stressful, traumatic experiences, but also starvation, diet, cigarette smoking, alcohol, a number of factors that are more a part of ordinary life than starvation may be. Though I now know that I am the product of generations that faced starvation as they made their way along the Trail of Tears and escaped to risk death and didn't have a whole lot of food for a long period of time before he married and began to reproduce. That dating and documenting experiences, factors that are being studied in terms of epigenetic influence are important, and we can integrate that. As well, during pregnancy, at conception, during pregnancy, and in utero, there are influences. And there are influences that Bowen so well describes in the nuclear family relationship system. Each of these influences can moderate or magnify the historical impact, which I think is something that's important to consider in tracing the epigenetic and adverse life, early childhood experiences for adults. So the full study of 22 people will allow me to begin to look at what are the differences for participants in this study in terms of the very important level of differentiation of self, to what degree are they able to operate independently without cutting off, and what is the indication of that physiologically in terms of cortisol and in terms of neural activity. But also, what are the differences in terms of the history of adversity and reactivity in early childhood and in past generations? What's the degree of cutoff between generations in relation to research on differentiation of self? So, thank you. I did this at home a dozen times and never came out within 20 minutes or 30. So I'm grateful to do this today. Thank you.
Well, that should have your brains stirred quite well. But let's hear what questions the three of you have, anybody in this, to ask for each other. See what kind of things you got started with.
I'd like to ask Pat to talk a little more about the connection between soil and society, which was part of Barry's thinking, but you're coming at that from a different way, and I think he kind of had to hurry at the end, so I'd like to hear a little more about that.
Well, my sense is that when I looked at the regression hypothesis, and you read it for everyone, and it seems to me that we had to get to some fundamental relationship between the human and the earth. And so what I did in my reading and my thinking was to try to identify what would be a fundamental relationship that that could have anxiety associated with it, and that could be of a chronic, sustained nature, and sufficient, therefore, to trigger or propel a regression. And in thinking, Hillel had talked about the soil functioning as a living organism, and indeed, given the composition of it, I mean, it is a prime candidate, and because the human is a terrestrial species, I mean, all life is terrestrial if we think of planet Earth then at that level, then one of the things that living organisms need is nutrients. It can take various forms because one species waste is another species food. So thinking about it generally, and so it seemed to me that if one is that food insecurity, and I think that Dr. Bowen's presentation this morning went into some detail about that food, if we look at food insecurity, we have a chronic sustained anxiety. And since the soil plays such an important role in the production of food that humans eat, and Hillel makes the point that since we find soil and its vestiges in the aquatic environment, it's also affecting that it seemed to me that looking at the societal soil relationship would help, and then looking at what happens when the soil becomes disrupted, again, thinking of it from an organismic point of view, then we now can look at how the human is impacting the soil and how the soil is responding, and that would be a reactivity factor operating at a fundamental level. And what further helped me to think about that was Bowen's description of the self, and he talks about the reactivity factors working in unison. And so if we see that then as an interdependent relationship between society and the soil, then we can begin to get at something fundamental that can fuel the kind of regression that he postulated might be active in that description.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to follow up on that?
I just know that our connection with soil is a fairly serious situation particularly in this country. How many tons of topsoil are lost in the production of how many tons of, say, growing corn? How long it takes in terms of hundreds of years to replace an inch of topsoil, and yet that we lose that pretty regularly. Erosion and wind and poor soil care, that fits with my understanding of what's going on and the regression happening at the same time, but to draw a line between those two things is helpful, I think. That is one of the places that gets expressed, this disconnect from the natural world.
Thanks. Ms. Harrison. Do you have-
I have got one comment and then a general question, really for both of you. Is this microphone working?
Great.
Murray Bowen did hear about Wendell Berry.
I don't know if Wendell Berry heard about
I don't think Wendell Berry heard about Murray Bowen, but, well, actually, he might have when I wrote him. He didn't answer. But Doctor, in one of the classes at the postgraduate program, I had just read one of Wendell Berry's collections of poems, and this particular poem was the Mad Farmer's Manifesto. And the line I read to Dr. Bowen is one I can't quote accurately, but perhaps you can correct me. The line is, "Be like the fox, make many tracks, some in the wrong direction, practice resurrection." Is that all right? And I always thought that Murray Bowen was pretty foxy, that he would head you off in a dozen directions, and some of them were the right ones. You got to figure it out for yourself. So one of my questions, really for both of you, is that I think you, Pat, Camilla, described ways that anxiety is a fundamental experience for humans, and perhaps for all life, that is present in relation to the natural environment. And I've been trying to think about anxiety in an evolutionary framework, as an evolutionary phenomenon. I think Dr. Connor touched on that earlier today. And I wondered if you would say anything more about how you see anxiety functioning for good and for ill at the level that you're observing man's relationship to nature. And I want to know from Robert Creech if Wendell Berry has any concept, or does he address anxiety in any fashion?
Do you want to start? I'm sort of a little bit exhausted at the moment. Well, when I think about the pervasive anxiety, one of the things that I focus on is the level of intensity of it. So if I am thinking about the societal soil relationship, I am interested in the level of intensity of the human's relationship with the soil. And so I live on the eastern shore of Maryland, which is an area of one of the agricultural areas of Maryland. It is an area that specializes in monoculture, and there are different crops that are the monoculture crops, including corn. And then on the animal production side, it's the poultry industry. And so the impact of those two industries at the level at which we're talking, I think you're talking about millions and maybe even approaching 1 billion chickens being raised. So they are raised for export, basically. If you think about it, much of the agriculture on the eastern shore of Maryland is an export economy, in the sense that the poultry, for instance, is being moved elsewhere. And so the impact of managing the waste products, the impact of the distribution of those waste products, the intensity of the agriculture that's done in those houses and everything is very great. And when I think about then now I'm going back and reflecting on my own family, when I finally described the intensity of emotional process in my own family, my nuclear family, and saw that the way the pattern reactivity worked and the quiet way actually in which was an intense form of emotional cutoff in the physical presence of but distant, then it helped me to begin to think about the impact on the soil. And then the Chesapeake Bay is the eastern shore bounds the Chesapeake Bay, and the nutrient outflows into the Chesapeake Bay and the impact on the aquatic species is enormous, and on some of the both plant and fish, for instance, and shellfish. So that's what one of my foci is on intensity of the production.
Can I follow up with one comment? What you remind me is that most people will think of anxiety as a feeling.
As a what?
As a feeling. As a
Okay.
feeling. And what I've observed, and I think what Murray Bowen was describing, is the reactivity itself to the experience of threat, either to self or to the relationship system or to somebody important. That given our level of connectedness or emotional fusion, we're going to register that. But it doesn't mean people will feel it. And at highest levels of intensity, that 14 hertz signal that provides a bridge between intellect and emotion goes offline, according to John Allman's work, that the level of anxiety can be reflected in the cutoff between intellect and emotional reactivity, which leaves us more at the mercy of reactivity itself. And that's one of the tricky things about observing anxiety. When it's high enough, we don't know we've got it. And it takes being a little less anxious to really see it. And then people want medication. But anyway, thank you for the intensity.
I don't know of any place I can recall where Wendell Berry uses expression anxiety or talks about any kind of automatic responses or reactivity. As I think about the way he sort of goes at looking at the human problem, he tends to point toward failure of humility and exercise of hubris or pride. Too much power, too little knowledge is one of the things he often talks about, our inability to live with the propriety of scale. Some of the kind of things Dr. Connor was talking about today, I think fit well with the way Berry thinks about what's going wrong with the human world. But his antidote to that is nearly always a kind of intentional thoughtfulness about thinking clearly about what you believe and how do you live in this world and what will you do and not do. That seems to be a path he's tried to walk on and that he urges, so much so that he ends up being thought a curmudgeon at times because he's fairly independently minded about a number of things, and it has been for a lot of decades. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I'll keep that in mind as I keep reading. I don't think that's his term, but
I think it's helpful to have a little more idea of what Wendell Berry was speaking about as you talked about it. So are you ready to take questions from this group here? Because there's, about 10, 15 minutes, but so much here that you can take advantage of if you have the thoughts right now to have questions for people up here.
I'm curious, Victoria, what did the participant, how does she account for her increased capacity to manage her differentiation through that process? How does she say it worked?
Well, Ms. McBride, let me ask Ms. B if she is willing to comment on, if I hear you, how does she describe or explain the increasing ability to be more thoughtful in the face of the anxiety
Yes, through the process.
through this process? I would be glad to hear that if she, I will, before I turn to Ms. B and see if she would like to do that, I do want to say, though, that my introduction of her and calling upon her to comment requires the confidentiality and privacy that is necessary in any professional audience, so that the fact that she will comment does not mean that it's an opportunity for people to grab her in the hall or outside this room and meeting to discuss the project. That's not appropriate. So with that, I'll introduce and see if Ms. B wants to add to that.
That'd be great. And then maybe I missed it, but is this going to be like a mixed methods where the participants feel it'll be straight quantitative? Okay.
Well, it will be, let Ms. B comment, and then I'll address your question about the methodology. Ms. B, would you want to comment? Would you go to the mic?
Thank you for the question. So as I understood the question, it was how I worked on differentiation through the process of learning more about the physiology and my family history and the work in the triangles. And I think the main aspect that guided me was to continue to try to increase my observation of myself as I went through this process, and to think how I learned my automatic responses in the three triangles that Ms. Harrison presented, and then to begin to try different things as I knew what my automatic was and knew over the time the patterns of the automatic responses from the other people in all of the triangles. And so I think that it was just an increasing process of watching and then trying some different things and seeing what I learned, and also to keep the aspect of theory in my mind and to say, well, my automatic might be that I don't want to go toward the anxiety of some of the triangles, in particular my uncle, but that I knew that in order to have any movement of change, I would have to do that, and sometimes it was easier than other times.
Good, thank you.
As family therapists, it's helpful. We know that those trained in Bowen understand the theory and the goals to reduce system anxiety and increase differentiation. We don't always know, unless we're doing outcome measures, what's helpful to the client. So I think that's part of our movement toward attempting to evidence-base the model in practice. I mean, that's what our goal is in education. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate your question about methodology. I practice Bowen theory. I'm not eclectic, and I don't plan to shift in the direction of a multi-model research project.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't see, there's no problem in asking people to complete a adverse childhood experience questionnaire and check off whether they had 1 of 10, which is unfortunately now the conventional questionnaire is down to only 10 subjects, 10 questions. I'd like to see the original 20-page questionnaire. That would be much more interesting for people to do. I think documents that require people to be more factual, not just self-report, but date and give facts as possible,
No question.
can be very useful. So I intend to use those and to write this up in a way that hopefully better brains than mine in any field can make use of. That would be my goal.
That'd be great. And then maybe later, if you move on with this, how do we count for or measure the therapist's level of differentiation through the process would be a helpful variable to control for also.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, Dr. Miller.
I have a sort of a thought and a question, and this is for Ms. Camella. I was struck with the soil depletion initiating trigger, and I started thinking of associations and wondered if you might think about it, because I started thinking of Hillel's discussion about depletion of soils that goes back to the early civilization, and I was thinking about my own research in the Chesapeake that triggered and thinks about soil depletion, and looking at the connection in terms of the scale of agriculture co-occurring with soil depletion, and that somehow it initiates societies to sort of ratchet it up to another level. And then I started thinking, like, my gosh, we don't understand of how many peoples moved across Europe, and that there were Celtic people in Turkey and other things. So there's been huge movements. And, and so I guess this is for Ms. Rossio too. Like, what the heck, timelines, that, and sort of, and your thought about, the change in agriculture, the change in the social relations, and all of that may be sort of a cocktail for a trigger.
Cocktail for what was the last?
For anxiety.
Okay. Thank you. Okay.
I'm sort of Hillel's books. Hillel is a prolific writer, and he is an agronomist. He's done a huge amount of work in Israel. One of his areas of specialty is water and the availability of water, and he also has work done agricultural techniques that do not have such an impact on the soil, such as ways of irrigating and the kind of environment in which is taking place. So I would certainly recommend Daniel Hillel for, especially his more popular, his books written for a more popular, a more general audience than the science audience. One of the things that's really fascinating there is that some of the soils that were exploited, as it were, during for thousands of years ago, remain sterile to this day. That they have never recovered, and I believe that in one of his books he discusses the various phenomena such as aquifer depletion, all sorts of things that go on when the soil and the water resources that underlie the soil, etc., the riverine resources that course through the soil in ways that press erosion. All of those are parts of the human impact on the environment, on the soil, and ultimately then getting back to a fundamental relationship on the ability of the earth to provide the sustenance that the human needs in order to survive. Human societies, from the small farms that Joanne talked about that were family-based through the totality of society, which is what we see now as there are vast exporting operations. There is efforts to acquire lands in still fertile areas not for necessarily the indigenous population, but for export to foreign countries. So we see these processes accelerating as well, and I don't know if that's getting to your question, but but it is, and technology, and the reason that I spoke about technology and went then was trying to see what is going on when the technology becomes more and more advanced, and so the level of usage and the rapidity of usage and the time to recover from the usage becomes also very much accelerated until finally nature just cannot keep up with that impact. And so then thinking about the human as a life form and its capability, what we see, and remember one of the quotes was in the human as a narcissistic creature who focuses on the near term. And so if we look at technological innovation, we often see that what the emphasis is on, for instance, in agriculture is on increasing the productivity, the yield, increasing the yield for either the local consumption or for the market, for use as a commodity to send elsewhere. And then thinking about, well, how do I capture, is this really an instinctual process? Can it become so automatic? And what we see in technological innovation is the emphasis, again, is on yield, efficiency, etc. And oftentimes then there's a lag time with the unintended consequences becoming apparent. But then looking at then the other animals that use tools in order to ameliorate their environment, we see that indeed they are. So that it is operating at, one can assume that that is part of the response and adaptation to that environment, and it's instinctual.
I think it's a book any day now between several of you.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, yes.
It's I teach practical theology at the seminary, so it's easy to sit in a room and think that soil is something farmers deal with, but we eat 3 times a day. And every time we eat, there's an impact on the soil. And our choice to, as much as possible, to eat food that is grown in such a way that it does not deplete the soil but sustains it, that is, treats the soil well, we get to make those choices, those of us that have any privilege at all, and many of us in this room have privilege. So we can make choices that one way or another impact the soil that we're talking about. It's not just the farmers who do that. Our consumption does that in a very real way. Sustainable agriculture is a set of practices that intends to be good for the farmer so that there can be a livelihood earned, and good for the soil so that it sustains life over generations, it's not depleted, and that it's good for the community. It doesn't poison the waters and the air. And those are practices that many farmers in this country are attempting to put in place. And if we can find local farms that are producing that way, if we can purchase in a way, we have an impact upon the soil, and we don't have to treat it like dirt. So I'll just say that.
Thank you, thank you. The afternoon is moving on, and there's a break now. So you can come back for the rest of the afternoon program. Thank you all.